I don't think, looking at this audience, that anybody here needs to be convinced that capitalism is a big problem that we all face for a whole variety of reasons at the present time. And I don't think I need to convince you that the issues of the environment are very urgent. And certainly since Sandy hit New York City, that's probably true for a lot of the population here, if they weren't already convinced of that. So what do I want to do with this talk? Well, what I hope to do is to give everybody ammunition to sharpen the way in which we can intervene both in the environmental movement with a Marxist class struggle perspective, and also go into the struggles that we are already very much a part of the workers and the most oppressed, and make sure that in laying forth the program, we include the environmental issues that are going to be on everybody's mind sooner or later. Certainly after Katrina, you could see how much racism and national oppression figure in when you talk about the impact of natural disasters and global warming. Now, I want to start off a little bit about Marx and Engels, because they lived and wrote like a century and a half ago. And climate change itself is a very modern problem. So why do we say that Marxism really is essential for this struggle to protect the environment, to both to build the struggle and to ultimately be able for humanity to solve this problem? Well, first let's say something about Marxism itself, because Marxism came out of a struggle of ideas about who people are. What is our relationship to the world around us? And Marxism has always explained that human activity is not something that happens in the abstract. Human beings don't behave the way they do because of God-given rights or this or that, but rather human activity is conditioned by concrete historical conditions. The relationship of people to the environment is not a fixed thing. Like so much of human behavior, it arises from the level of technological development achieved. This is basic to Marxism. And most important, I think, in dealing with it in any kind of a practical way, you have to understand that these social relations flow from the level of technological development. And social relations today means the struggle, the class struggle, primarily between the workers, and especially those who are the most oppressed, and the bourgeoisie or capitalist class. For example, we know that on this continent, the indigenous people had a very different attitude toward nature than did the European settlers. Why was that? Well, they viewed their own role as being in harmony with all living things. They hunted for food, for example, but they inculcated a healthy respect for the animals, and they only killed what they needed. Now contrast that with the scenes of carnage that were described by Mark Twain in one of his books, when he wrote about how in those days, in the sort of mid-19th century, the people who had come, whose ancestry had brought them here from Europe, they would ride those early trains that crossed the Great Plains with a rifle in their hand, and sit where they could actually shoot out the windows at the hundreds of buffalo as they passed by them, and leaving just hundreds and thousands of carcasses on the plains to rot. They did it partly for sport, and they did it partly so they would deprive the native people of a basic food supply, so they would either starve or be driven off the land. But the Europeans' view of themselves, the way they felt when they did this, was that they were conquerors, not stewards of the land, but conquerors of the land. Now, we Marxists, we would say that these opposite views of nature come not from some genetic or inborn difference between the people who were indigenous to North America and the people who came over from Europe, but rather that they represent different contrasting social systems. The indigenous people, by and large, were communal. They shared the wealth they had. They cooperated in the struggle to survive. They didn't exploit each other. Instead, they did all they could to help each other because existence was very difficult. But the European settlers who came brought capitalism to the Western Hemisphere. Their ideology fit in with this predatory system that allowed a few to become wealthy by exploiting the labor of the many. So if it was okay to exploit fellow human beings, to enslave them, to beat them, to whip them in this way, well, why not nature itself? You know, if you were the rulers, the lords of the universe, you could do that to animals without even thinking about it, and despoil the environment in other ways too. I'm not saying that was the attitude of everyone who came here, but it was the prevailing attitude, certainly from the Spanish conquistadors to General Custer and to the wealthy planters who demanded the Holocaust of the slave trade. And let's not forget that while chattel slavery was the form of class exploitation used in the South and in some of the Caribbean colonies, it was different from the slavery of ancient times in this way. Modern slavery was designed to serve the demands of a world capitalist market in cotton, sugar, other commodities, which made it much, much harsher. Why? Because the market was so much bigger. You could get, the owners of the slaves could make themselves so much richer by heavily exploiting those workers. So when we look at the degradation of the environment that is now affecting the climate of the whole planet, we should remember how it began. And for that, I want to give you a quote from Engels, the one that was mentioned by Naomi that we put up for reading material, in which he talked, this was in 1883 that he wrote this, right? That's 120 years ago or more, 135 years ago? No, it's exactly 130 years ago, right. He said this: the social science of the bourgeoisie, which he calls classical political economy, is predominantly occupied only with the directly intended social effects of human actions connected with production and exchange. This fully corresponds to the social organization of which it is the theoretical expression. When individual capitalists are engaged in production and exchange for the sake of the immediate profit, only the nearest, most immediate results can be taken into account in the first place. When an individual manufacturer or merchant sells a manufactured or purchased commodity with only the usual small profit, he is satisfied, and he is not concerned as to what becomes of the commodity afterwards, or who are its purchasers. The same thing applies to the natural effects of the same actions. What did the Spanish planters in Cuba, this is Engels in 1883, what did the Spanish planters in Cuba, who burned down forests on the slopes of the mountains and obtained from the ashes sufficient fertilizer for one generation of very highly profitable coffee trees, what What did they care that the tropical rainfall afterwards washed away the now unprotected upper stratum of the soil, leaving behind only bare rock? And think of Haiti today, as well as Cuba then, and many other parts of the world. Then he went on to say, in relation to nature as to society, the present mode of production is predominantly concerned only about the first tangible success. And then surprise is expressed that the more remote effects of actions directed to this end turn out to be of quite a different, mainly even of quite an opposite character. So you can see how capitalism drives the degradation of nature as well as of human beings. He really describes this situation that we're seeing today in sort of its full-blown element. So, and the problem has now become worldwide. And it's not just climate change. There's so much economic activity: mining, lumbering, fishing, production of chemicals, thousands of different chemicals, the demand for ever greater sources of energy that have damaged the environment and depleted the natural resources. And it's not just because of population growth, as some might argue. The US, for example, has less than 1/20th of the world's people, yet it is responsible for nearly half the world's accumulated emissions of CO2. I'm not talking about each year, I'm talking about what has accumulated like over the last century or more. The US is responsible for nearly half. You can find this in charts online. Remember this, the US has had the world's largest capitalist economy ever since, at least since World War II. US corporations not only have the biggest economy here, but they go around the world, pumping out the oil, extracting the copper, cutting down the forests, all to make a profit. And the Pentagon directly harms the environment with its bombs, its vast consumption of oil. The Pentagon is, actually it's not even the whole Pentagon, I think it's the US Navy alone is the world's largest consumer of oil. And its energy consuming bases in the deserts of the Middle East, you can think of all the ramifications of this huge military industrial complex and the effect on the environment. Now what about, how is it going to be fixed? How is this all going to be fixed? Well, to fix a problem as big as climate change, you have to first be able to define the problem correctly. It has taken scientists decades to overcome the energy lobby so that global warming change has been generally acknowledged, certainly by scientists and pretty much in the media, although not by most of the politicians. But the science became overwhelming, and in fact it led to a split in the scientific community. I mean, there were the outright shills for the energy corporations that were just paid to be deniers of climate change. But there were others who played it down. One interesting, one example of a split is that the head of NASA just resigned from his position, James Hansen, who was, NASA has had a lot of military implications to it, and of course they send, they send up satellites, but they also sent people to the moon and all that. But they have the satellites to be able to see what's going on around the whole world, polar ice caps, everywhere. They can see that a piece of Antarctica, the polar ice cap at Antarctica broke off. That's the size of Connecticut, I think, and is floating around down there. They can see all of that. And so even in this, highly significant and politically significant agency like NASA, you have somebody who has come out very strongly on the question of blowing the whistle on climate change. But even here, just establishing the scientific basis that there is climate change and that human activity has led to it, because it's led to the accumulation of CO2 gases in the atmosphere, that still does not explain why society has not dealt with it. And here is where so many of the leaders of that kind of very technocratic element of the environmental movement are constrained from going much further than just, saying that it's happening. But why it's happened and what to do about it is really not in their field, their purview, And we should, it should be obvious, maybe it is, but to compare the fact that there's been so little action by not only this government, but the governments of all the imperialist countries on this issue, which is of burning importance to the world today and for future generations, compared to the resources that and the speed of the mobilization of their resources that they will put into war and aggression. Just think of it. The hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars every year that go into the Pentagon compared to what they're doing about this very critical situation. And so we need to pose to people in the movement, well, after all these decades of dire warnings, why has nothing changed? After the Midwest drought, hurricane after hurricane, widespread tornadoes, massive floods, why not? Why? No international agreements have been reached that really are effective in reducing carbon dioxide emissions. The attempts to regulate capitalism, to set limits, not successful. One of the big things a few years ago, and I think Al Gore was one of the people who was pushing this, was to try and use the market to restrain capitalism and make the capitalists, make it in their interests to reduce emissions in the process of production. It was called cap and trade. And the way it works is this. A government issues a certain number of certificates for that allow a certain number of emissions of CO2 to the industries that are polluting. And then there's a market. It's like the stock market. It's a market where you can sell these the right to pollute, right. So the idea was that, well, if a company, reduced its emissions, then they could sell their rights and get some money that way, and then so it would be profitable for them to reduce their emissions. But guess what's happened in Europe? This whole scheme that's been, where there's a big market in these things. The market is in disarray right now. Why? Because the European economies are so bad that production is down, and therefore emissions are down. Carbon dioxide emissions are down, not because the process has been made cleaner, but just because they're shutting down factories, they're shutting down, everything, because the general capitalist economy is in such bad shape. So it means that there's a glut of these permits to create emissions. So you can't sell them for anything. You can't. There's no more market for the permits. So the whole cap and trade thing is now a bust, and they're writing about it in the capitalist media and saying, "Oh, now what are we going to do?" So this whole thing is not just a problem of the science. Is it a political problem? That is in the narrow sense of electoral politics. Well, everybody knew the Bushes were hand in hand with the energy industry. I remember when the senior Bush ceased to be the president, the first thing that happened was that he went to the Middle East and was given all these enormous presents by the emirs and the sheikhs and, you know, the ones who were all tied into the oil industry, and which they didn't do when he was president, because he would have had to turn it over to the country. But once he was no longer president, he could keep it all. Gold, diamond-encrusted wristwatches, all kinds of stuff. I remember reading it at the time. So, you know, so there, you know, there's the Republicans, right? But why haven't the Democrats then made a big issue out of climate change? Do you think it would be a perfect issue? Yet everybody should be aware, the whole issue of the environment was barely mentioned in the presidential debates. And the Obama administration is just as pro-war as the Republicans. Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, you name it. And at home, there's the opening up the Arctic for oil exploration, the fracking crisis, which is coming right close to home here. They raised tariffs 30% by 30% on Chinese imported solar panels, so people can't afford them now, who thought maybe they could afford to put solar panels up. And the Keystone Pipeline is still on the table. So picking one capitalist party over another is not the solution, and we should, you know, be pointing this out. I think what the quote from Engels made clear is this, that for capitalists, pollution can be very profitable. They can just walk away from the problem. The overriding factor in their decisions is to maximize their profits. Cleaning up the mess is not their problem, just as the health of workers is not their problem. The education of workers, especially in periods of high unemployment, is not their problem. Now, the approach of most of the environmental movement is to get laws, agreements, etc., that would make environmental protection the problem of society as a whole. But are we really going to get these laws passed? Who are the lawmakers? Who are the governments? Only when it suits the interests of the capitalists will the bourgeois politicians curb the corporations' predatory practices. And for every law they pass, for every fine they lever, there are 100 or 10 or 100 or other cases where the capitalists just get away with it. I mean, think of what just happened in Texas and with the safety violations. That fertilizer plant explosion killed 15 people. That's 5 times the number of deaths as you had in the Boston Marathon. It injured scores more, and it destroyed the whole town of West Texas. The name is the town is West. But where are the calls in the media for stiffer laws, more inspectors? You know, this is a time of the sequester. You know, they're cutting back on all this stuff. They're not adding to the inspectors. Some 4,500 workers die every year from job-related accidents. Many more die from long-term effects of pollution. If the capitalist government won't spend the money to protect these workers, is it going to spend the trillions that would be necessary to reorganize production, transportation, housing, and so on, so as to reverse global warming? Because that's what's required. So, how do we combat the degradation of the environment? We say it has to be an integral part of the struggle to end capitalism. Capitalism requires an ever-expanding market and ever-expanding production. If production drops, the stock markets panic. Capitalism is the driving force behind rapid, unplanned industrial and agricultural development. And what they produce is not what people need necessarily to lead a healthy and satisfying life. It's just whatever makes the most profit for the bosses. That's the nature of this system. Asking it to change is like asking a tiger to become a vegetarian. Why are vast forests chopped down each day to produce the New York Times and other capitalist news media? Because most of their space is devoted to advertising, which is essential to expanding the capitalist market. The amount of news takes up less than half the paper. The system is now at the point where it is choking on its own productivity. Yet it must go on trying to produce more and more, cheaper and cheaper. This is a prescription for disaster. Economic disaster for the workers, with unemployment rising all over the world, and so on. And the result is worldwide. We are in an ecological emergency. If the working class controlled the economy, well, wouldn't we be putting every available person to work, restoring the health of the planet? One of the first things a revolutionary workers' government would do is get a plan to lower greenhouse gas emissions without hurting the people. Take the hundreds of billions now spent on war and bank bailouts and rebuild mass transit. Get rid of the military-industrial complex and all the useless polluting industries that profit off war. Green our cities to cool them in the summer. Plant millions of trees to naturally sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Help insulate older homes so they burn less energy and provide solar panels to everyone who wants them. Rebuild the energy grid so electricity is not wasted. Focus on the most efficient, least polluting sources of energy and devote resources to their development. At least that is necessary to turn the situation around. But it seems, and is, impossible to achieve when the capitalists and their politicians decide everything. Without a revolutionary perspective, the prospect seems too bleak to contemplate. So most of the solutions being offered are to go back to small-scale economies, co-ops, family farms, etc. And really, I think we all know that's nothing but a pipe dream. It sounds lovely, but you're going to leave about 4 billion people in the world starving to death if you do that. But there is another trend in the environmental movement that was expressed in Bolivia, later in Cancun, when large gatherings of environmental activists hit capitalism as the cause of global warming. And in South Africa, demonstrators at a UN climate conference showed how the big imperialist countries wanted to shift the burden of cutting emissions onto the developing countries that are just now getting some industry. It all boils down to the class struggle that Marx and Engels saw as the lever for social change. The class with the least to lose under capitalism is the working class. The harsh conditions of capitalist decay are forcing our class to rethink everything, discard any prejudices they have been taught, and embrace new forms of struggle. Workers' World Party believes that this global environmental emergency will become yet another nail in the coffin of this cruel and dying system. 2 points myself, one having to do with socialist countries and the other having to do with our demands. So let me take the thing of the socialist countries first, because there are still, some very important countries that, to one degree or other, are trying to develop socialist economies. Of course, Cuba is the nearest example of that. And I think we have already, had some good discussion about their trying to promote healthier agriculture, get fresher food to the people, and so on, in a way that's sustainable. They also, we must remember, although Cuba has not contributed hardly less than 1% to the world's carbon dioxide emissions, they suffer a great deal from the hurricanes, and which have been getting worse and stronger. But they have the world's leading program for protecting lives and property when a storm hits. And there are many storms that have done a great deal of damage to surrounding countries. No one in Cuba has died. No one has been seriously injured.
11 died.
Well, I'm not saying in all the storms, but I'm saying in many of the storms that have caused a lot of damage and deaths in other countries, they have actually come through with nobody being killed. This last one was an exception to that, actually, where in Santiago, I believe, particularly the eastern side of the island, were hit very hard in a very populated area, and 4 people did die. but that was unusual for them. And it's based on, you know, it's because of the organization of the whole society that they're able to do this. Because the people who are living along the coast, who are the most vulnerable, are moved inland, and the people inland put them up. You know, they stay with them. They don't get all herded into some huge auditorium or something where the toilets break down and all this. They become friends in the process. You know, it's a way of deepening the ties among the people in the society. The other country I want to talk about is China. Because all we hear here is, you know, how bad the pollution is in China, and, you know, you see a lot of pictures of it and so on. And it is. Air pollution is very bad, especially in the Beijing area, but for a complex of reasons. I won't go into that now. But James Hansen, who I mentioned before, who was the head of NASA and who just resigned, he went to China about a year and a half ago. And he said publicly about the question of climate change, he said, China is the hope of the world. Now, that must be one of the reasons that he was forced out of his job, that he said that. And why did he say it? Because China is the only large economy that has a plan for conversion of the energy that's used, building all kinds of new, less polluting energy sources, conserving energy, scrubbing emissions out of the smokestacks, and just generally has a plan for the economy. Shanghai has a whole bunch of satellite cities around it. One of them is a pilot project that is totally green and puts nothing into either the air or the water that will harm it. Nothing toxic, nothing bad. Traffic is controlled in a different way there and everything. So I just want to say that China's, you have to look at China as from the point of view that there are two competing social systems existing inside China today. And that a lot of the polluting industries that used to be in Europe and the United States have been exported to the so-called third world countries, right? And so the emissions from factories and so on in these countries are replacing the emissions that used to be here in the U.S. or in Europe. They're now there. So China has industrialized, but a lot of it is capitalist industrialization and doesn't have the same kind of control over it, and is not part of the plan in the same way that the development of China's infrastructure has. China's infrastructure is done almost entirely by the state, and that is under a great deal of planning, which is moving toward a greener economy, and that's, I think, what Hansen was talking about. Second of all, I want to just say that my emphasis, of course, was on, you know, how we've got to be against capitalism and end capitalism, but I also think that we have to apply to this question just as we do to every other, whether it's the unemployment, the economy, or I had another example in my mind. Maybe I'll think of it in a minute. The same criteria in terms of demands. We're not against raising demands, immediate demands. We're for immediate demands if they can improve the situation in some way. This is what I want to say. We take, for example, something like the immigration question. We are part of the movement calling for legalization. The bourgeoisie comes along with their own way of making it sound like they're going to carry out reforms. We expose that, but we are with the movement that is calling for legalization. So our paper that's going to May Day has a headline exposing this immigration law, which some people probably still think is going to be a good thing. And it's really a bad thing. And it's the same thing like with something like cap and trade. That came from the bourgeoisie and was imposed really into the environmental movement that this was going to be an answer. But there are many other struggles and demands that we would support and we want to be a part of them, but always in a way that we're helping to educate whoever we're working with that the problem is much bigger. And, you know, that we've got to organize for a much bigger struggle against the whole system.